Hello and welcome to the Lettering Drawing in a Different Way panel. I hope everybody's having a great show so far. My name is JOHN WORKMAN. I host the Robots from Tomorrow podcast, and I am thrilled to be able to moderate a panel on lettering with the talent assembled here. I'll let them introduce themselves in a second, but first, I hear we have some SCAD folks in the audience. Quick show of hands. How many artists, art students, or other letterers do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. Great. Well, in that case, I'm going to, like I said, shirk my moderator duty and have these gentlemen introduce themselves, and then we can throw it open to questions right away. Why don't you start?
Who wants to go first?
You go first, Rick.
Okay. Hi. Can everybody hear me back there? Okay. My name is Rick Parker. I am a cartoonist and got my start working in Marvel Comics in the production department doing lettering corrections in 1977 when I was 30 years old. It was the first real job I ever had. It was the only real job I ever had. My experience in lettering is that I lettered my notes when I was in high school. I used all capital letters. And I dated a girl at Marvel Comics who was a letterer, and I'd never even heard of Marvel Comics, but I went over to her house and saw what she was doing. I thought, well, hell, I could do that. But who wants to be, you don't want to go into competition with somebody that you're interested in dating. Anyway, one day she said to me, I'm getting married and moving to Tucson. And I thought, okay. Anyway, I became a cab driver after that at some point, and I was driving up Madison Avenue in 1970, maybe 75 or 76, and I passed Marvel Comics, and I said, oh yeah, that's the place that my ex-girlfriend took me, and what a cool bunch of people they were, and boy, wouldn't I like to work at a place like that, although I was never planning on having a job. I was an artist, and I was going to stay in my studio, and some art gallery guy was going to send me a check for $3,000 a month. That didn't quite work out like that. But I saw Stan Lee leaving the building talking to Big John Verporten, and I said, oh yeah, I remember those two guys. And anyway, as I went another block, I said, oh Christ, my girlfriend lives in Tucson, Arizona, and she's married to a doctor. I could go up there, and I bet they'd give me a job. Well, I did go up there, and I showed him my portfolio, and Dan Adkins looked at my work and said, I did drawings, you know, and I even had we won't say what I had. It'll all be coming out in a comic book one day. But to make a long story short, I got a job at Marvel, answered an ad in the New York Times in the Help Wanted section. They used to have that on Wednesday. It said, wanted, artist, letterer. I thought, well, I'm an artist. My girlfriend was a letterer. I think I could do that. So it turned out it was Marvel Comics. I went up there. They hired me right away. And I worked there for about the next 18 years. And while I was there, I lettered the Spider-Man strip for Stan Lee and John Romita. I lettered the Hulk strip, and I can't remember who was drawing that. And I lettered Rip Kirby, which was another strip. I lettered Prince Valiant, that comic strip. I lettered Wolf and Bird, Counselors of the Macabre, that was done by Patton Lash, and it appeared in the New York Law Journal. I also I was the main letterer of all 4 Spider-Man books through the 80s, and I lettered over 1,200 comic books for Marvel over the years until, the company kind of imploded, is that word? The company was bought by a corporate raider, and he was more interested in owning the rights to the characters so that they could exploit them in the film business as opposed to the publishing business. At least that's my understanding. I'm not an expert in any of that. But I did love lettering. It was very zen for me, and it enabled me to stop thinking about whatever was bothering me in my life. And there were a lot of things that were bothering me in life. You know, there's a few things that are bothering me right now, to tell you the truth. But anyway, that's enough about me. This is JOHN WORKMAN.
I'm JOHN WORKMAN. The most important advice I ever got in my entire life was in 1969 when I made the acquaintance of Basil Wolverton. I was afraid to ask him how to correctly pronounce his first name, so I called him Mr. Wolverton all the time. But he told me to learn to do everything. And I was drawing and writing and lettering badly. And coloring a little bit too, although I thought I was worthless as a colorist. But the lettering was just wretched. I took some calligraphy classes and got worse. And finally I started stealing. I looked at what Ben Oda had done, and John Costanza, Gaspar Saladino, my hero. And I tried to be them, and I failed miserably. And finally, I looked at a 1946 issue of Comic Cavalcade, and the lettering on the Green Lantern story looked pretty neat. So I started doing a million A's based on what I saw there, and then B's and C's, and working my way through the alphabet. I don't think I ever learned how to do proper balloons until I was up at DC in '75 doing the lettering for them. I'm still learning, still coming across people like Frank Ingley, I think it was. Incredible stuff. Oh, wonderful.
Newspaper strips, right?
Yeah, Frank Ingley. I've been going, my reading of comics lately has gone back about 90 years, 80 or 90 years. I just finished going through Popeye from 1928 to 1938. I read the entirety of Terry and the Pirates from the initial strips up to 1946. And I'm learning new things that I never knew before, and I hope I continue to do that.
Yeah, did Frank Ingley do Terry or Steve Canyon?
I believe it was Terry.
Terry?
He might have done Steve Canyon.
This is beautiful.
He was,
Yes.
I'm Kevin Nolan. I'm not a real letterer like these two gentlemen, but I've done some hand lettering on my own work when they would allow me to do that, because it's virtually all digital now, for obvious reasons. Be sure to make corrections, etc. But when I was an amateur would-be comic artist and putting samples together, I wanted them to look professional, so I worked really hard on my lettering because I didn't want, I think it's true that the best artwork can really be ruined by sloppy amateur lettering. And the reverse is true. The questionable artwork, if you got Gaspar Saladino or one of you guys lettering, suddenly it looks so much better than you thought. So I realized at an early age that lettering was important, and I also found out that I really enjoyed that part of the job. That drawing, penciling, and inking can be frustrating, but I think you used the word zen or something. It's, when you get into that frame of mind and it's flowing and stuff, it's a wonderful feeling. So I'm more of a lettering fan than a letterer, but I had a brief time at Marvel where Carl Potts had moved into editorial and was such a friendly editor. If I said I wanted to do something different, he'd throw me one of those jobs. I said, I think I want to do more lettering. So he sent me logo assignments and at least one 12-issue series that I lettered. That's another reason I hate Carl Potts.
Yeah. Well, and then people would
Just
say,
kidding.
What are you doing with lettering? I said, I like lettering, but I quickly got frustrated and started doing more drawing. Anyway, so yeah, my experience is pretty limited, but I did do some logos and some interior lettering through the years, and I'm basically just a fan. I want to be here to kind of tap their brains and find out what pinpoints they use and things like that.
It's too late to tap my brain, friend.
So, yeah, that's my story.
Well, I'm Steve OLIFF, and much like arriving late to this panel, I was a late addition to this panel because not only I've been doing lettering display. My mother was a sign painter and painted letters, so she taught me the forms early on, and so all through high school and stuff I would do things. But where I actually, since I do some of my own comic, I'm mostly color comic books, if anybody doesn't know what I do, but I have drawn my own script and I've done lettering for posters and t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. And where I first became aware of the importance of lettering was when I saw my first Spirit story. And I have no idea who was doing the lettering on those things, but it blew my mind. It was incorporated into the art in ways that I've never seen. It was really, recently I read a book by Eisner about sequential art and stuff, and how the lettering can and the words and the way that you present them can create a sense of time and space and distance, and it was just fascinating for me to see, you know. So, and then as a colorist, like I found again, like what he was saying about the lettering and things, you know, good color can help artwork, bad color can hurt it. And like I worked with John on remastering Walt Simonson's entire Thor run, and his lettering was some of the most fun that I had coloring, because I looked at his forms and then figured out, well, now what can I do with this? They're so bold and so interesting that I tried to incorporate the color to become a part of his lettering and enhance it. And I hope I succeeded, but that's up to everyone else to decide.
I would say one thing you overlooked there. Steve basically created the digital coloring that
Yes.
that we all are so familiar with today in comics. In the old days, you might tell horror stories about how color was done on newsprint comics. Steve's the guy who figured out that with a computer you can actually make your own separation. So a colorist can be more than just making guides. You're doing the separator shots. You have full control, and that was a revolution at the time. And this is really the guy that did it. So
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. So. Okay.
That answered about 4 different questions I had written down here, so thank you all for that. Speaking of questions, I saw some hands of people who were art students and people like that. Who's got a question?
Yes, this question is for JOHN WORKMAN. You had mentioned one of my favorite letterers earlier, a few moments ago, Gaspar Saladino.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the thing with Saladino is, I mean, he was a master, obviously, of just all these different fonts and titles, and just, his stuff is so distinctive, you know. But I also heard a rumor, and I don't know if it's true. Is it true that he used to file down his nib points to a certain angle? And if so, what process would he use to get it down to that certain point?
I think he used a stone. You guys might know a lot more about this than I do, but I tried that several times, and I ruined so many pinpoints. I never got to the point where I could do what he had done. But yeah, everybody, I think, Ben Oda, all the guys, they filed them down to the where they wanted them. But I never got a real hold of the process.
I can say a few words about that.
Okay.
First of all, I want to tell you that when I was working there, and starting in 1977, the comic books were 17 pages long. That was how the stories were. But the very first page of every comic book, which, as you know, is called the splash page, is usually just a big one-panel page. Those pages were given out by the art director or the production manager who gave out the work in those days, Big John Verboorden, to Gaspar Saladino to letter, because John Verboorden and many other people considered Gaspar the Saladino to be superior to all other letterers who were working in that time. And the persons whose name on the book, for example, somebody showed me a copy today of Hulk 219, which was the very first comic book I lettered. And there on the first page it says lettered by Rick Parker, but the splash page was actually lettered by Gaspar Saladino. So you're looking at some great lettering on page 1, you buy the book, you get home, you open it up, and you turn to read the story, and then you turn to page 2, and what happened here? You know, suddenly, wait a minute, Rick Parker, that first panel, that panel isn't even closed. There's a big open space there. I mean, you know, what was he doing? That was the very first job I did. But I was taught by Jim Novak Jim Novak and I were in charge of the lettering corrections at Marvel for a couple of years, and then Jim went freelance. And Jim taught me how to file the points down. And for the most part, we were using, for the thick and thin lettering, we used a Hunts Point 106, which was kind of, the Hunts Point 102 is, is the croak wheel pen, the flexible nib. Hunts 106 didn't really bend that way. So you'd take the small plastic pen holder, you would cut a little bit off the tip of the pen and then file it down and then smooth it out, and I'll tell you how that worked. Well, it'd be easier if I could draw it, but anyway, you put in the point, and you rotate the pen 180 degrees, and then you've got that round part, and then you take a pair, if you're right-handed, things might work differently for left-handed people, but I was right-handed. You take a pair of scissors and you clip off at a 45-degree angle just the tiniest amount of the two little things on the end of the thing that you can. And once you've done that, then you get a piece of emery paper and you wet it and you put it down on a flat surface, and then you write the word Johnson over and over again. Danny Crespi told me that Johnson, the word Johnson, has all of the strokes and the marks that you need or you will ever use. So with Johnson, Johnson, Johnson over again. I found out later that Johnson actually means something different, but we won't talk about that. Then with dry wet sandpaper, after you've done that, then you can test it out on a piece of paper. You will have to wipe the crud off of it first and then test it out. And then you can take a piece of ordinary window glass and wet that. And I confess to you, I wet that with my own spit. What do you think about that? Then I made little circles, round circles with figure eights, until I'd really smoothed that thing down to the point that it was really nice. You could wipe it off, dip it in ink, and then try it on the paper. And yeah, starting to get a really smooth line. Write the word Johnson on a piece of paper and see how that feels. And then Jim Novak, I didn't do this, but Jim, well, Rick, you can't just have one pen prepared, you have to have 3 or 4. So when Jim prepared pens, he'd make 3 or 4 of them at the same time. And that was probably an efficient thing to do, because nobody wants to be working on a story and then suddenly your pen goes bad or the end of it falls off or it's rusted away because you've been using it for so long. So Jim made 3 or 4 of those things, and that was just for the thin lettering. And what was nice about that, when you lettered a vertical line or you lettered a curved line, the actual contact with the paper would change because the point had been filed down a little bit. And you got this really interesting line that was not of uniform thickness. And you could get some, it was just pleasant, beautiful to look at. And for the thicker lettering, so the word was, if a word was bold or if it was going to be emphasized, we'd usually just letter the word in italic with the same pen that we use for the thin lettering. But if the word was going to be bold, I used an A5 for comic book lettering, and sometimes a B6. These are speed ballpoints, and that's straight out of the box. No filing really was necessary on those. And then if it was going to be a little bit extra bold, we used a B5.5. And I would say those were the main pens that we used for lettering. And also I would say that it makes a big difference how much ink. The pen would sit in your ink jar, and we made a little holder that would fit on the drawing table so that the thing was level, little cardboard holder. You know what I'm talking about? Make a little holder so you can put it on your table, and it's right there. When you put the pen in the ink jar, it has just the right amount of ink in the jar. So when the pen sits there, it's automatically dipped to the proper level so that when you take it out, you don't have to fiddle with it or blot it or anything like that. It's got just the right amount of that you can just start lettering right again. And the other thing is to always use fresh ink. You don't use the same ink every day. And it didn't bother me because Marvel was paying for all of the art supplies. We got rid of a lot of ink. But and keep the ink at night if you want to try to keep the ink covered. We used a little, it was called Pro White, this little jar of white material. And if you got rid of the white stuff, these little ink jars were just right. A couple of pens would sit in them without any problem. It also came with a lid. You could take the pens out and wipe them clean, keep your pens nice and clean all the time, and then put the little lid back on the ink jar. Maybe it might last a day or two. But, that was basically the care and maintenance of the pens and the pen points and how you got them to practice on a little piece of paper. And if it's doing what you want, then you can switch over to the comic book pages. And I'm sorry if I'm taking a long time, but I'm one of those guys that never shuts up if he's given a chance.
Can I ask John because I'm curious what pen point you used for your lettering?
I went all over the place. Finally, I kind of settled on Speedball. I used the FB pens.
Easier to clean.
Yeah, and they were just, I really liked them. But then I went to Rapidographs, And I found that you had to hold it in a certain position to really make it work best. And I was back in New York, walking near the Museum Museum of Modern Art. And there was an art store there, and it said, new T.G. Castell pens, $4 each. So I went in and bought a couple of them. And that night, I would work on freelance stuff for DC at night and on staff during the day. But that night, my rapidograph that I used for most of the regular lettering fell apart in my hand. And I thought, well, let me try that Castell stuff. And I really liked it. You could move in whatever direction, you'd still get a good firm line. And it didn't clog as easily as the Castell or as the rapidgraphs did. And I used those for years. And then they stopped making them. And Todd Klein and I went around and bought every Castell TG pen we could get a hold of, figuring we had enough for the rest of our lives, but we didn't.
Lucky for you.
Well, nowadays, the last thing I did for Walt Simonson, Walt is probably the last of the people who insists that his stuff be done on the boards. And he gets his way, usually. But the last thing I did for him, I used some kind of marker. It wasn't a micron, but it was something similar to that. I'm having a hard time I can use them, but the ink isn't dark enough, and I worry about graying of ink. I have a Vinnie Coletta story I can tell you about graying ink. But anyway, I still have a handful of TG Castells around that I use when I need to, but
Are they similar in design to a rapidograph?
very similar.
Plunger and.
Well, they're so much better.
Okay.
You know, I hate to interrupt this, but I just realized that John Workman never thanked me for being an idiot. Walt Simonson had approached me to letter Thor, and he explained to me that he wanted the borders on the panels to be kept open, and the balloons were going to be open to the board. I tried to talk him out of that to the best of my ability. Finally, he realized, I don't know what's wrong with this guy. I remember he got up and he walked away. Well, he's a great guy. But then he found John, and everything was fine after that. Thank you. You're welcome, John.
Any other?
But did you file down the FBs to get the?
No.
Because your style has less of the thick and thin stroke,
Yeah.
right? It's more of a uniform stroke.
I kind of like that look, and although I remember being in the production department up in DC and having to make changes and corrections at times in lettering, and I could not become Gaspar no matter how hard I tried, but I made the attempt. And I could do a bit Oda and other people. The guys who really threw me were the Philippine artists. They would have lettering that was thicker on the sideways than it was up and down. And I didn't have a pen that could do that, so I did what Jerry Robinson did on Batman back in 1940. I would do double the thickness of the line, so it took forever to do that. And I was happy when they only wanted one word changed or something like that. Yeah, there's so many different ways to do things. Nowadays, I worked out a method of lettering using a Wacom tablet. All my stuff is hand lettered into the computer. And I have to be deliberately messy in order to make it look human. And on stuff where I'm getting a lower pay rate or where they need it tomorrow, I will sit there and type, which I don't really like. But even there, I go in and I play with the A's and the B's and all that. The question marks especially, I usually don't like whatever typeface I'm using, font I'm using, whatever the term might be. And I will change the question mark, other stuff.
Change
John.
it so that it just.
It looks better.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff just.
John, I have a story to tell about remastering the Thor over your lettering and stuff. One of the things that happens when you bring back, rescan in older art is what he was talking about, the ink sometimes. So when we were doing that, there were places where his lettering would be broken up. It would just be messy. And I had to develop a whole technique in the computer to select your lettering, expand it by a pixel, to smooth it out, and then reduce it back down to the size so that it would be clean. Because I'm kind of, one of the things when I remaster stuff, I think most production people they don't seem to care when they give it to me to color, because there's chunks that'll be like panel borders that are just broken all up, and I'm kind of maybe I'm anal about it, but it's like I wanted it to look good, and so I've worked extra hard to get your lettering to look good on that job.
That's good. Thank you.
Just send him a check, send him a check.
Any other questions? The gentleman over there.
Yeah, you were talking about the care you were taking to at least vary the computer font, because that's one of the, I like a lot of French graphic novels. You see this lively hand lettering. Then when it's translated, you use the computer font. Every E looks like every other E, every W looks, and there's a sterility to it that doesn't capture the same liveliness that the art does. And it's like American publishers, and they're only paying the reprint, so they're not paying the artist directly. They still cut corners. And that's really frustrating. Does anybody still do hand lettering? Because it matters. It makes a huge difference.
Well, it matters to me, and that's why I do the hand lettering into the computer, because everything's going to be different, even if it's in a very subtle way. I remember I actually got to have a nice talk one time with Mobius. He came up to the office, and luckily he spoke English very well, because my French is terrible. But he I don't know if I believe him to this day, but he told me that he liked what I had done on doing the English version of his lettering. And I didn't try to emulate him, really, although I learned an awful lot from just trying to be something of what Mobius was as a letterer. But an old thing that Basil Overton told me that I still don't believe, really.
I thought his name was Basil.
Basil. Basil. He told me that I would get to a point where I wouldn't need guidelines. And that has never happened except with Mobius. I could, he had such a bounce, to his stuff. And I could kind of simulate that, and I didn't have to have any guidelines for it.
I think Toth did that when he lettered his own work. He didn't use guidelines.
I did not know how he did that.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
It's stunning. Yeah, I love that, and it integrates so beautifully with the artwork, and that's like you were saying. I will never get to the point, I don't think, where digital lettering is the equal of good hand lettering.
Yeah, we've entered into a very important part of this debate here. The digital lettering versus hand lettering. I hope there's going to be a lot more talk about that.
Well, part of it, my pet theory is comics ideally communicate, even subliminally, this hand-drawn look to you. This idea that almost like discovering someone's diary or something. You jotted down these things. If it gets too slick and too plastic, you lose that feeling. And I think that's what's going on with good hand lettering. Like, we can give a million examples, but the free-form look that Mobius had in his lettering, lettered himself, or Jim Aparo doing his own lettering.
Well, Mobius said something too. We were talking about Frank Thorne and Aparo and Toth and all that, and how their stuff had such uniqueness to it. And he said that to him, if he didn't letter his own stuff, it would be as if he had drawn a nice page and then brought in somebody else to ink on the heads.
Yeah.
Well, Winsor McKay is a great example of that. I mean, he had this breathtaking art, and then his lettering is just an afterthought. It looks like he let his not particularly talented kid lettering.
I felt the same way about his stuff. I thought the lettering itself, the letter forms were nice, but his balloons were terrible.
Yeah,
He
that's what I meant,
encroached
the
on
balloons.
the lettering, and all that beautiful artwork, And one time, years ago, there was a book published where artists sort of reinterpreted Winsor McCay,
Yeah.
or the strip anyhow. And somebody called me up about lettering one of the pages. And I thought, here's my chance. What I did was, I went to my McCay stuff, and I found a page with some good, sharp lettering on it, and I scanned it in. And when I got they sent me a scan of the artwork to work with, and Winsor McCay lettered that page through me. I scanned his letters, I took them individually and placed them. I maybe played a little bit if there were two letters together, something. Not a lot of lettering on that page, maybe only one balloon. But anyway, then I took one of his balloons and I played a lot with it, and I gave it some air and you know, made the lettering look better and flopped it onto that page. So Winsor McCay really lettered that page with a little help from me. And it was just such great fun.
And you could see from the editorial stuff that he could letter.
Oh,
You
yeah.
saw his editorial cartoons, he was an amazing letterer. But it's like he did all this meticulous work on the comics pages, Little Nemo,
Uh-huh.
and then just put it in bad lettering.
Yeah.
And it shows you how important lettering is to integrate to the artwork.
I'd like to show something, because we've been talking primarily about the dialogue lettering, but for me, what I mostly like to do is the more display kind of lettering things. And I'm going to show you guys, would you hold this for a second? I happen to use that for t-shirts that I work on. That this is one of the ones, I wore this specifically to show you guys today. This is actually a Dave Sheridan ad from Playboy for KSAN Radio in San Francisco with my display lettering over the top of it. So they're fun. I do a whole series. I've done about 10 years of these loose t-shirts. But for me, it's like that kind of lettering they're talking about. Now I know why my dialogue lettering was so bad, because I didn't know about how to smooth things out or things down. I'm just a kid out in the country. But I did like to do this kind of stuff because it's a lot more fun for me.
Any other questions?
I did have another question. In regards to once you get the pencil page, right, from the artist, and you have to go ahead and, you know, put the sound effects and the dialogue balloons and everything on there. Do you put the guidelines like right on there and just lightly pencil in your dialogue first and then make your corrections and then ink it? Or how would that process work?
I would put in the guidelines on it using the Ames guide.
Yeah.
And I did it, well, I won't go into the Ames guide stuff so much, but anyway, I do that. Now, if I was uncertain, I got to the point where I could look at something and figure this fits there. But if I was really uncertain, or if it's really tight, I would roughly pencil it in. That was not the usual thing that I did, but it did happen. That brings up a quick story. Vinnie Coletta and I got along well. He was a real character. But one time we had a bit of a disagreement. When I was doing my own stuff, I was still out in Washington State, and I was a teenager, early 20s and all that.
You were a teenager in the early 20s?
I'm older than I look. But I had read somewhere that the traditional way of doing it is you do your lettering guide, you do your lettering, you make the balloon, and then you erase those guidelines. So I did that, and I thought, wait a minute, this is stupid. They're going to erase the whole page anyway, because they get rid of the pencil guidelines for the figures and all that after the inking's done. And when you do that, it takes there's a possibility of graying the ink if the lettering has been erased twice.
And it matters what type of eraser you use.
Oh, yeah.
Do not use a kneaded eraser.
Well, Vinnie Coletta never erased anything in his life, but he
Never drew anything in his life either.
But he got angry at me because I had stopped doing that when I was still a kid. I realized it was ridiculous. But he was bothered by the fact that I hadn't erased those guidelines. And one other thing too, I would maybe do an intricate background in pencil, and if I erased the stuff right in the middle of it, I didn't know how to connect things on either side of the panel. It could hurt the art. So anyway, Vinny objected, and a meeting was called. Saul Harrison, the vice president, Joe Orlando, and Vinny and me. And Joe was strangely quiet, but Vinny presented his case, I presented mine, and Saul stood up and said, "What John says makes sense," and walked out. The meeting was over. And there have been things like that where, you know, you gotta, when I first started up at DC, I thought my lettering was still terrible, especially my balloons, but I knew that a lot of the balloons they were using were awful. If you look at stuff from the 1970s at DC, there'll be a nice kind of a shape at the bottom, and there'll be a kind of almost a straight line going across the top of the stuff. And someone, I don't believe this to this day, but someone told me that Carmine had dictated that no balloons would touch the top of the panel, which was crazy. Carmine was a master of design. That doesn't make any sense at all. But when I started lettering the interiors of the books, I did cover stuff for a while. I ignored that so-called rule.
Is that where everything had to float? Is that what you mean? All the balloons had to be floating?
They could not touch the top of the panel. It was nutty. It made no sense. It encroached on the art. And I did my breaking of the borders, which I stole from Carmine and Al Williamson and other guys who were doing. They didn't do it like to the degree that I did, but they did it, and it looked good. It made it turned a rectangle into something, an interesting shape, you know, the panel borders. And but anyway, I just ignored this silly thing that was sort of being accepted by everybody else.
You lucky you didn't wind up in the bottom of the Hudson River, pal. Vinny Coletta, Carmine Infantino. Anyway, I don't know what my role is here. I feel really awkward because these guys are so eloquent. They explain things so well. I'm trying hard not to say anything, but I can't help it. But I apologize in advance. But anyway, I think Vinny didn't want. The reason Vinny wanted you to erase the graphite behind your lettering, because the inker is supposed to erase the graphite on the page, and he didn't want to do any extra work. So any Vinny's relatives here? I'd like to know so I can leave now. Okay.
Now is not the time to ask that question. Just really quick, John, you wanted me to make sure that you were prompted to tell a Tom Orzechowski story. So why don't you go ahead and do that?
I got one too.
Really quick, sort of aside first. When I was 21 years old or thereabouts, I went to a convention in Portland, Oregon. Maybe it's a little bit older, and it wasn't in the 1920s. But I met this kid. He was 17 years old, and he could draw like you would not believe. He was amazing. And I showed him my artwork, and he showed me his, and he said, Mike Friedrich's doing this thing called Star Reach. You want to contact him and see if he might do something there. So on the way back to my hometown there, I wrote a story in my head that I actually typed out, which was strange for me. I like to do everything myself. But in this case, I typed out a solid script, and I did a single page as a sample and sent it off to Mike. And he either called me back or wrote and said, go ahead and do it. And turned out I was in Star Reach #2, which amazed me. I was in there with Neil Adams and Dick Giordano, and I felt like, what am I doing among these guys? But years later, Mike told me that the reason I was in there was this other artist hadn't finished his story for it. The other artist was that 17-year-old kid, Dave Stevens. So I really do owe Dave quite a lot. But when I did the Star Reach story, Mike called up and he said, I forgot to remind you to put a copyright notice on it. And he said, but I'll take care of it. And when I got the artwork back, Tom Orzechowski had lettered in copyright John Workman, maybe the date, I don't know. And I thought, holy cow, a real letterer has lettered on something that I drew. And I'm not kidding. I took a magnifying lens and studied that JOHN WORKMAN there. Tried to ascertain how he had done these letters and the size. I measured the size of them and all kinds of things because it was real lettering opposed to my stuff.
I'm just thinking about Tom Wojciechowski. One of the other artists who really likes hand lettering on the show is Eric Larson.
Oh, yeah.
And Tom did a bunch. So I saw a lot of that coloring in his work. He's just very, very good and a great guy.
And speaking of, just as a weird, I guess, sort of aside, Tom Wojciechowski did the signage for Comics and Comics. We were talking about California logos and signage and stuff. They had sort of a small chain of comic stores in California in the 80s, 90s, or whatever. Comics with a C and then Comics with an X. It was one of the first logos that sort of popped out at me, and I was like, oh, and then I realized done by Tom Wojciechowski, and I'm like, oh, the X-Men guy. Oh.
He never stops
really
working.
Any other questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Yeah, my personal favorite letter is someone that I haven't heard mentioned yet, which is Joe Rosen.
Oh,
And I was wondering if any of you guys have appreciations or stories about Joe Rosen.
I got a story about everybody. Joe Rosen was Sam Rosen's younger brother, and Sam and Joe did a lot of great lettering. I don't know if anybody here is are you all familiar? Is anybody here familiar with Sam Rosen's work?
Yes.
Yeah, he was in my opinion, Sam Rosen was one of the great comic book letterers. And Joe Rosen was really good. And Joe Rosen, I worked in the production department. My job was assisting Jim Novak and doing the lettering corrections. And when books that were lettered by Joe Rosen came into the office, they weren't sent to the production department for any corrections. The guy never made a mistake. I wondered, how the hell does he do that? His letter forms were, you know, there was nothing, they weren't heavy on style, but they were very nice looking letter forms. And the balloon shapes were all done very nicely, and you know, he got the work in on time, which is very important. You know, the books come out on a schedule, you got to get that work done. One day I was working at Harvey Comics, and Joe was a freelancer, and he went around to different companies. I'm sure he worked for DC too. He worked for Marvel, he worked for Harvey Comics, and I was going to walk over to Marvel Comics from the Gulf and Western building, which was on Columbus Avenue, I think, and 59th Street, and Joe was headed over there too. So I got to walk over with Joe across Central Park, and on my way over to Marvel, we talked a little about lettering. I've never really spoken to him before. You know, he didn't come into the bullpen and talk to the staffers. You know, he just was in the editorial department. Anyway, he said, "You check your work over before you hand it in, don't you?" The thought had never occurred to me. So yeah, I mean, that's my Joe Rosen story. Check your work, folks. And you, young man, you mentioned something about penciling the lettering in ahead of time.
Yes, sir.
I lettered 1,200 comic books to Marvel, and I never penciled the lettering in ahead of time because, you know, that takes extra time. It's almost, you could say, it almost takes twice as much time to do it that way, and you're getting paid by the page. So do you want to make $12 a page, or do you want to make $6 a page? One time, I can weave this in with Tom Wojciechowski. For whatever reason, Tom Wojciechowski had been lettering the X-Men. You could say it was his regular book, and I was in the bullpen, and Tom Wojciechowski wasn't available, and Roger Stern, who's the editor of the X-Men, came in with a script by Lynn Wein and some pencils by, I'm trying to remember who it was that had penciled that job. I think it was John Byrne. Anyway, he said, "Here, Rick, we'd like you to letter issue 115 of the X-Men." Okay, thanks. You know, to me, it was just another job. You know, I was not a comic book freak, geek, or whatever you want to call it. To me, I was thinking of it. I later came to love comics, but to me, at that time, it was just a job. And after the editor walked away, this other young guy who was working with me, Michael Higgins, rolled over on his office chair and he said, "Rick, you better do a good job on this book. This is Marvel's top-selling book." And I was thinking, what, don't you think I do a good job on everything I do? And he said, "You know what, I'm going to show them. I'm going to take this book home and I'm going to make it perfect." I took that X-Men book home, I looked at the script, I penciled in all the lettering on all the balloons so that the wording was just right on every line and I could draw a nice balloon around it. I penciled in the sound effects and instead of just winging them before inking it. I took that job in and I handed it in. The editor, Roger Stern, didn't say anything. I don't remember if he was there, but he didn't come out later from his office and say, Rick, hey, great job. You know, nobody said a damn word. Weeks went by, nobody said a goddamn word. And then the book came out, and nobody said a word. And I'm sitting there, and I happened to see Chris Claremont talking to somebody out in the hallway outside where I was sitting. And I didn't know Chris Claremont, you know, but I knew he wrote the script. So I went out to Chris and, hey, Chris. And they interrupted these two guys who were having a conversation. Hey, Chris, how'd you like the lettering on that X-Men book, huh? He looked at me like I was crazy. Like, it was okay. It was okay? You know, I mean, I spent all of this time doing all of this thing to make it as good as I could possibly make it, and nobody even noticed. Well, from then on, I just looked at the script, dipped my pen in ink, and lettered in the stuff. I never penciled in the ink, but penciled in the lettering before. Folks, I do not recommend that you do that. I recommend that you pencil in the lettering on the pages before you ink them. It's very important not to divide any words. It's very important that the balloon shapes are nice and regular. And it's very important that the words are on the right places in relation to one another. So yes, make it as good as you can make it. Don't worry about, you know, time. You know, particularly if you're doing your own work, you want it to look as good as it could possibly work. Now, I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to say this because I don't know how much time we got left, and I want to give these. I'm not going to say anything after this. But to me, I think the most important thing is that hand lettering is better than computer fonts. Yes, there are advantages to computer fonts, but I would rather have a good hand lettered job. It's just got more character. It's got more soul, and it's preferable to me. Also, the most important thing is no letters touching, because that makes it harder to read. Don't let your letters touch. And also, the overall most important thing is it has to be easy to read. And if anybody's taking notes down here, write the 3 words, easy to read. Make sure your lettering is easy to read. You don't want to do anything which is going to make a comic book more difficult for somebody to enjoy. Thank you very much, and I have nothing further to say.
I'm going to follow up on what he said, though, about the lettering not touching. I just recently remastered the Absolute Swamp Thing, the whole Alan Moore run, and so much of the lettering had been expanded through bad film and stuff, and it was running together, and I had to retouch thousands and thousands of letters just to get them, to give them that air that the letters need.
Isn't that as
He's everything.
time-consuming as lettering it in the first place?
What?
Isn't that as time-consuming as lettering it in the first place?
More time consuming.
Well, what it was because, well, I'm just going to badmouth DC's production department a little bit. Even for doing an absolute edition, which is supposed to be their top stuff, I found that they really dropped the ball. There's nobody absolute taking care of the line art before it went to me, the colorist. And I just couldn't stand to look at it because, to me, an absolute edition is supposed to be perfect from the coloring down to the lettering and stuff. So I spent endless hours on production that I didn't get paid for, but that's just because I have a particular standard that I want to see, and I didn't care. I mean, I knew it was extra, but whatever, there's 1,000 pages, you know, so it kind of averaged out. I made a little, and had enough money coming in that it wasn't that I had to worry about it being, but it really was depressing to see the lack of care that the production department had in sending out artwork to be remastered with the coloring.
I heard a story one time, and I don't know what to believe about this and what not to believe, but I read V for Vendetta, and a wonderful, wonderful book. But it was hard to read. And my understanding, and again, I don't know if this is real, but that was sent out, the films on that, the negatives or positives, whatever they used, were sent out to so many different companies in different countries. And they would, you know, get rid of the English and put in their own stuff, and then they would clean off, you know, the red material that they used for the.
The ruby leaf.
Yeah, and it adhered to the letters.
Oh, so it would break them up.
The middle of the A's would fill in, all kinds of things happened to it. And when they were going to do the initial compilation book at DC, they knew already that things weren't great with the initial, the first series things. But they were assured by the printer that they would clean it all up and be pristine. And it wasn't. It was really hard to read.
Yeah,
You
I
couldn't
remember that.
tell an A from an R. It was awful. They really should have relearned.
I know that I'm not supposed to say anything because I wasn't going to say anything before. But I got to tell you, it's very a lot of people who are working on these comic books. Some of the people that are working on these comic books care more than others. Some people don't care, but in general, I would say one of the saddest things that is happening that happened in the comic book world is that only a few people seem to realize how important the lettering is to the enjoyment of a comic book. And I think the reason that they didn't do a lot of these things that you are talking about, that you know they should have done, you care about it, is because they didn't realize that these things were even important. And, letterers are artists. Lettering is important. It takes up space on the page. It's part of the architecture of the page. You cannot read a comic book, you cannot read anybody's story without looking at the lettering. And it has an effect. It's very important. Most people do not realize that. But if you're all letterers or interested in letterers, you should keep in mind that what you're doing is very important, and that it has to be as good as you can make it. And I think it makes a big difference in the enjoyment of the quality of the book. Whether people can measure it or not, it makes a difference.
Well, I found with my computer lettering that I do with the Wacom tablet, that's kind of fun. It can be interesting, creating the lettering and all that. But the real fun and the real contribution that I think that I make is in the placement of the balloons. You can't cover important things, of course, but you can make the artwork more interesting by the placement of it. I like to put things behind a character, maybe, part of the balloon, and it just gives it more of a three-dimensional thing. My breaking the border places that right on the panel border. But sometimes I'll bring it out from there, so it's coming out of the panel. Others are at the panel distance, others are back further, and it really helps. I see so much comic lettering these days. I'm going to sound old and all that, but it looks like the stuff's just flopped on there. It's sitting on top. And
Not integrated, yes.
yes,
Well,
yes.
it is. I mean, what they're doing is like for the colorist, okay, since the lettering is done digitally on top, the artist done on there, you never know where the balloons are going to be. So I end up, artist has to draw all the stuff, I color stuff all underneath, and then half, this detail of stuff is then covered up with lettering, but we never know where the lettering is going to be.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that brings up something that's a mystery to me. I've noticed this a lot. When they started renumbering Batman for the third time or whatever, I did the first 5 issues on that, so I can say I lettered Batman #1. But back in the 1920s. But at that time,
He hates my guts.
at that time, the colorist, I don't think, was shown the lettering. So when the book appeared, all my title for it, all my sound effects, they were all in one.
Oh.
They hadn't been colored. Well, I kind of raised a stink about that, and suddenly I saw things maybe being given to the colorist for another look at and a decision to be made, and things would look a lot better.
Well, because when you have display types of like titles and stuff, you need to know, because that, as you're coloring it, the colors on the lettering and the caption boxes has to be part of the entire color scheme for the page. And if you can't see that, or I've had some beautiful colors, and then they do the lettering and put caption colors in, my God, what are you thinking? It's just horrible.
Well, I've taken to demanding that when the script is written, the dialogue is ready to go, even if the thing hasn't been drawn yet, give it to me, and I can at least start doing the lettering. And if I need to restack it or something, some of them, that's okay. Rather than getting it after the fact, after the coloring has been done and all that. But also, they can show the lettering to the colorist, and they'll realize, oh, hey, this is cool here, so I'll make that one there.
Exactly.
But they weren't doing that at all. I saw so many, especially DC. I don't want to just pick on DC, but it happened a lot at DC. That the titles and all were white, and it had this unfinished look to it. And
Yeah, white looks like a mistake.
sound effects were white.
No, that's not right.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Do you know if editors still do balloon placements for letters?
Some of them do. A lot of them. I remember doing the Hulk, and they said it's yours to do the placement if you want. And I kind of like that. But something like Legion of Superheroes, the assistant editor used to do the placement on that, and whether it had 2 words or 100 words in it, he always had a thing about the size of the cord. And so but they were useful because there were so many characters that they at least told me who was talking. So I could look around
The
it.
pointers were going to the right people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah.
I think I always treated those balloon placements, which were scrawled with magic marker on full-size photocopies of the original art. I always treated those things as kind of like a suggestion.
Yeah.
They were often done by people who did not know what they're doing. But obviously, it's extremely important that the balloons be read in the proper order, and that captions don't lead somebody into the wrong, lead the reader into the wrong panel. There's a lot of stuff that you have to really make sure that it's right, because so many things can go wrong. It's tough, folks.
Well, there's something else. This may seem like a minor thing, but when you have characters talking to one another, the balloon tail is really important. I rarely point directly to somebody because there's a mechanical feel to it. So I'll curve the thing a little bit toward the person talking. And especially if they're antagonistic toward one another, one should go in one direction, the other should go in the other direction, or even this way at times, away from the center of the balloon. That would be a little more rare thing. But psychologically, it helps to show who these people are. And there's so many very subtle things, and you have to kind of decide what you like and what works when you're doing lettering. Walt Simonson had a pet peeve that I shared, so I changed my way of doing things because I thought, well, Walt believes in this too. But when the balloon tail goes off into the off panel, yeah. Traditionally, it starts out thicker and then winds up pretty thin down there. And there's I won't call it ugly, but it doesn't look great. So Walt made a point of telling me, go from thick to thin to thick as you hit that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And wow, it works so much better. It looks so nice.
I hate to do this, but we are out of time for this panel, and I don't want to get in trouble. So can we give these gentlemen a nice round of applause?
I just want to say that I'm at table 1725, and if anybody has any questions about lettering, or if anyone wants to show me any lettering, I will be happy to look at it.
Actually, we'll extend the panel just a little bit. For the rest of you gentlemen, could you mention where you are on the show so people can go, your tables, like what tables you're going to be at?
I'm at 610, 611.
1815, I think.
1801.
Okay. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.